Hello there, welcome to Nighttime Stories. I hope you've had a wonderful day. Was it amazing or just okay? Drop a rating from 1 to 10 in the comments. Now it's time to unwind. I'm here to help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Before you get cozy, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe. It helps bring more bedtime stories your way. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin. I never used to be paranoid. I always rolled my eyes when my mom warned me about strangers on the internet, her voice laced with that tired parental concern. Don't talk to people you don't know, don't share personal details, and for God's sake, don't meet up with anyone. I'd heard it a million times, and I thought I was careful. My social media was private. I only accepted friend requests from people I knew, and my location settings were turned off. I was just another teenage girl posting stupid selfies, venting about school and sharing funny memes. Nothing that should have stood out, nothing that should have caught someone's attention. But I was wrong. The first message came late one night while I was scrolling through Instagram in bed. "You looked really pretty in that red sweater today." I frowned. My last post had been from last weekend, and I wasn't wearing red in any of my pictures. I checked the username, user 984,721. No profile picture, no posts. Just an empty account. I dismissed it as a troll and ignored it. The next day, another message. "I saw you walking home. You always take the long way, don't you?" A strange, hollow feeling settled in my chest. I did take the long way home sometimes, but only when I wanted to clear my head after school. I never told anyone that. It wasn't a route I took regularly, just something I did on impulse. I showed my best friend Rachel at lunch. "Probably some loser trying to mess with you," she said, popping a chip into her mouth. "Just block them." So I did. I wish I could say that was the end of it. That night I got a text from an unknown number. "Blocking me won't make me stop watching, Lily." My stomach flipped. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I stared at the screen, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I checked the number, no name, no caller ID, just a string of digits I didn't recognize. I took a deep breath and typed back, "Who is this?" The response was almost immediate. "A friend." I didn't reply. The next morning, I double-checked all my social media accounts. My Instagram was still private. My Snapchat location was turned off. There was no way a stranger could have been keeping track of me. But someone was. At school, I tried to act normal. I sat with Rachel at lunch, joked around with my friends, and forced myself to focus in class. But my eyes kept flicking toward the door, the windows, the people around me. I started noticing things I hadn't before. A dark blue sedan parked near the school entrance, the same one I thought I'd seen near my neighborhood. A man in the grocery store who seemed to be in every aisle I was. The feeling of someone standing too close behind me at the coffee shop. Maybe it was just paranoia. Maybe my brain was playing tricks on me. Or maybe it wasn't. That night, I got another text. "You should really lock your bedroom window." I dropped my phone. My stomach twisted violently. I had left my window unlocked. It was something I barely thought about. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked during the day. Hands shaking, I ran to my window. It was closed, but when I tried to slide the lock into place, I felt the smallest resistance, like it had been moved recently. I slammed it shut and locked it. Then I grabbed my phone and typed out a message. "Who the hell are you?" No response. I barely slept that night. Every creak in the house, every shadow from the street lights outside sent my heart racing. I kept checking my phone, waiting for another message, waiting for something. The next morning, my mom found me staring blankly at my cereal. "You okay, sweetheart?" I almost told her, almost, but I didn't want to worry her. She had enough on her plate with work and my little brother. And besides, what would I even say? "Hey, Mom, I think someone is watching me." So I forced a smile, just tired. That day at school, I noticed something new. A small, wrapped box sitting in my locker. No note, no name. I hesitated before picking it up, my stomach churning with unease. It was light, barely weighing anything at all. Rachel leaned over my shoulder. Ooh, secret admirer. I forced a laugh. Yeah, right. I unwrapped it slowly, heart pounding. Inside was a single item, a hair clip. A very specific hair clip. The kind I had lost a month ago. I hadn't mentioned losing it online, hadn't talked about it to anyone. I barely even remembered it was missing. But someone had found it. Someone had kept it. I felt sick. Rachel was still peering over my shoulder. "Cute. Who do you think it's from?" I shoved the box back into my locker. I don't know. I did my best to act normal the rest of the day, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. When I got home, I locked every door and window in the house. That night, my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But I had to. "You look so beautiful when you're scared, Lily." I dropped the phone and ran to my bedroom mirror. I had been home alone for hours. No one should have seen me. And yet, they had. I didn't tell anyone. I should have, but some deep, gut-wrenching part of me thought that saying it out loud would make it worse, like acknowledging it would give this person more power over me. I told myself that if I ignored them, if I stopped reacting, maybe they'd get bored, maybe they'd stop watching. But they didn't. I deleted my social media the next morning, Instagram, Snapchat, even my barely used Facebook. I changed my phone number, made sure every window and door was locked, and refused to go anywhere alone. I wasn't an idiot. I knew this wasn't some harmless prank. This was someone who knew my habits, my home, my secrets. And they weren't going away. For the first time in my life, I felt trapped in my own skin. At school, I kept my head down, stomach churning with anxiety every time I felt someone's gaze linger too long. It wasn't just paranoia caught people looking at me, but I couldn't tell if it meant anything. Was it just normal teenage curiosity, or was one of them the person behind the messages? Rachel noticed. "Okay, what's going on with you?" she asked at lunch, flicking a fry at me. "You've been weird for days." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to unload everything, tell her about the messages, the gifts, the feeling of being hunted. But how do you say something like that without sounding insane? "I'm just stressed," I lied. Rachel narrowed her eyes. "Uh-huh, sure." I forced a smile. "Really, it's nothing." She didn't look convinced, but thankfully, she let it drop. That night, my mom worked late, so I was home alone. My little brother was at a friend's house, and our usually lively home was eerily silent. I checked the locks twice, shut every curtain, and curled up in bed with my laptop, trying to distract myself with Netflix. Then my phone buzzed. An unknown number, again. My stomach tightened as I hesitated before picking it up. "Did you really think deleting your accounts would make me stop watching?" I felt sick. My fingers shook as I typed back. "Who the hell are you? What do you want?" I watched the typing bubble appear, disappear, then return. "I just want you to appreciate me the way I appreciate you." I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. I don't know you. A pause. Then, but I know you, Lily. I know everything about you. I couldn't breathe. I threw my phone onto the bed and stood up, pacing my room. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do something. Instead, I grabbed my laptop and did the only thing I could think of. I looked up how to track a phone number. Most sites were useless, just ads for paid services that probably wouldn't work. But after an hour of digging, I found one that let me trace general locations of incoming messages. It wasn't exact, but it would tell me the city, maybe even the neighborhood. My fingers trembled as I entered the number. Loading. My breath caught. The location popped up. My town. I felt like I was going to throw up. This person wasn't some stranger in another state. They were here. I stared at my screen, mind racing. Who could it be? A classmate, a teacher, a neighbor. A sound outside made me jump. Footsteps on the porch. My heart pounded. I grabbed my phone, creeping toward the window. A small wrapped box sat on the doorstep. I felt the blood drain from my face. I stared at it for a long time, my body frozen. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every instinct screamed at me to throw it away, to pretend it wasn't there. But I had to know. I stepped outside, my skin prickling with fear as I bent down to pick it up. The air was cool, silent. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty road. Whoever left it was already gone. I unwrapped it slowly, hands shaking. Inside was a necklace. A necklace I had lost 6 months ago. I gasped, my vision blurring. My mind reeled, trying to remember where I had last seen it. It had been at Rachel's house. I had taken it off in her room, left it on her dresser. We searched for it for weeks, tearing apart her bedroom, but it was just gone. Until now. I dropped the box, my pulse hammering in my ears. I backed inside, locked the door, and ran straight to my room, grabbing my phone. I needed proof. Whoever was doing this was getting bolder. They weren't just watching me anymore. They were inside my life. I took a deep breath and did something I should have done from the beginning. I set up a camera. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old webcam I hadn't used in years. I plugged it into my laptop, pointed it at the porch, and set it to record. If they left something again, I would catch them. I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like a threat. I clutched my phone under the covers, fighting the urge to text Rachel, to call my mom, to do something. But I was done feeling helpless. The next morning, I checked the footage. Nothing. No movement, no shadows, no figures creeping in the dark. I exhaled slowly, my body aching from exhaustion. Maybe, just maybe, they were done. Then my phone buzzed. I picked it up, dreading what I'd see. "You looked so cute checking the camera this morning." My vision blurred. My stomach clenched painfully. I hadn't checked the footage in the morning. I'd done it just now. They knew. They had seen me. And that meant... I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The camera. It was pointed at the porch. The only way they could have known was if they were watching me from inside the house. I couldn't move. My skin was cold, my breath shallow, my pulse a distant, frantic drum in my ears. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't just watching me. They were inside. I stood frozen in place, every muscle in my body locked in terror. My bedroom door was closed. My closet door was closed. My window was locked. And yet, I felt them. Watching. Waiting. I forced myself to move, slowly, silently, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached for my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. The call barely rang once before the line clicked. A voice spoke. Not the operator. Them. You shouldn't have tried to catch me, Lily. I dropped the phone. My body moved before I could think. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy bedside lamp, and turned, my back against the wall, scanning every darkened corner of my room. My closet, my desk, the space beneath my bed, they could be anywhere. I bolted. I threw open my door and ran down the hall, nearly tripping over my own feet. I needed to get out. I needed to get out now. My front door was just at the bottom of the stairs. If I could make it outside, I could scream, run to the neighbors, get someone to. A sound stopped me cold. The creak of a floorboard. It was soft, deliberate. It came from behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body refused to move, every nerve screaming at me to keep running, to keep going. But my mind told me I had to see. Slowly, I turned my head. There, standing at the top of the stairs, was him. I expected a stranger, some nameless, faceless monster lurking in the shadows, but I was wrong. I knew him. My best friend's dad, Mr. Caldwell. He was wearing the same warm smile I had seen 1,000 times before, the same friendly, fatherly face that had watched me and Rachel since we were kids. But now, it was wrong. Twisted. There was something in his eyes I had never seen before, something hungry, something sick. I didn't want it to be like this, he said softly, stepping forward. I backed down a step. Stay away from me. You weren't supposed to figure it out, he continued, ignoring me. His voice was calm, patient, like he was explaining something simple to a child. You were supposed to love me, Lily, the way I love you. A sickening wave of nausea rolled through me. Love. Oh God. Oh God. I could barely process what he was saying. My mind was screaming at me to run, to fight, but I was frozen. You were so perfect, he murmured, so sweet, so innocent. I've been watching you for so long, making sure you were safe, keeping you close. My mouth was dry. My voice was barely a whisper. Why? He tilted his head, smiling almost sadly. Because I knew one day you'd belong to me. I turned and ran. I flew down the stairs, my feet barely touching the ground. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps quick, too quick, was chasing me. I hit the front door and yanked at the lock. It didn't budge. Oh God. The deadbolt. He had locked the deadbolt from the inside. I fumbled, my fingers slipping, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I could hear him getting closer, feel the air shift as he reached for me. And then, the house alarm blared. A deafening, piercing screech. I hadn't even realized I hit the panic button on the keypad, but I had, and it was loud. Louder than my fear. Louder than him. I heard him snarl a low, frustrated growl I had never imagined coming from him. I turned, just in time to see him stumbling back, eyes darting toward the windows, the flashing lights from outside. He hesitated. I didn't. I unlocked the door and ran. I didn't stop running, not even when I reached the neighbor's porch, not even when they opened the door, eyes wide with confusion and fear. I didn't stop until I was inside, until I collapsed onto their floor, sobbing and shaking as they called the police. They caught him that night. Mr. Caldwell was found hiding in my house, tucked away in the attic crawl space where he had been living for weeks. Watching me, listening, waiting. The police found his laptop, his phone, hundreds of photos of me, screenshots of my social media posts, my texts with Rachel. He had been reading everything. He had been inside our lives in ways I never imagined. Rachel. I broke down when I saw her. She hadn't known. Of course she hadn't. She sobbed when she found out, horrified, disgusted. Her father had been stalking me. Her father had been the monster in my walls. He had been taken away in cuffs, his face blank, emotionless, like he didn't understand why we were all so upset. The trial was quick, the evidence overwhelming. He was sentenced to 20 years for stalking, breaking and entering, and intent to harm. Rachel never spoke to him again. Neither did I. But sometimes I think about that night, about how wrong I was. I thought stalkers were faceless strangers in dark alleys, lurking in shadows, following from a distance. But they aren't. They can be the people closest to you. The ones who smile at you across the dinner table. The ones you trust. I don't post online anymore. I don't talk to strangers. And every single night, I check the locks. Twice. I first noticed her on a Monday. It was cold, the kind of sharp morning where you can see your breath in the air, and the bus stop was nearly empty except for a few early commuters. And her. She couldn't have been more than 11 or 12, standing near the curb with her backpack slung over one shoulder. She wasn't playing on a phone like most kids. She just stood there, shifting from foot to foot, staring down the road as if she was waiting for something that wasn't coming. I remember thinking it was odd kids her age usually had parents hovering nearby, but she was alone. I got on my bus, sat near the window, and glanced back at her one last time. The next day, she was there again. Same spot, same posture, same distant look in her eyes. For weeks, it became part of my routine. Every morning I'd walk to my stop, and she'd be there at hers. I never spoke to her, never had a reason to, but I always noticed her. Always alone, always waiting. Then, one morning, she wasn't there. I didn't think much of it at first. Kids get sick, they sleep in, they miss the bus. But then another day passed, and another, and another. By the end of the week, I caught myself looking for her. I'd glance toward her usual spot, expecting to see that small frame, that faded backpack, those restless movements. But she was gone. And no one else seemed to care. I hadn't even realized how much I had expected to see her every day until she wasn't there anymore. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I didn't even know her. She was just some random kid at a bus stop. Still, a nagging feeling settled in the back of my mind. I told myself I wouldn't ask about her, that it wasn't my business. But a few days later, as I was grabbing coffee at the corner cafe, I found myself asking the barista just casually, just in passing, "Hey, you ever notice that kid who waits at the bus stop across the street, the little girl?" She frowned, confused. "What girl?" "The one with the backpack," I said, feeling oddly self-conscious. "She was there every morning for weeks. She hasn't been there lately." The barista gave me a strange look, then shook her head. "I don't remember any kid." That was the first time I felt that creeping sensation in my gut, the one that whispered, "Something isn't right." I brushed it off. Maybe she just wasn't paying attention. Maybe she wasn't on shift in the mornings. But the feeling didn't go away. I started asking around casual questions at first, to regular commuters, shop owners. No one remembered her. Not one person. I told myself it was normal. People don't pay attention to strangers, especially not quiet little girls standing at bus stops. But I noticed her. Why didn't anyone else? The thought burrowed into my brain, gnawed at me while I worked, while I ate, while I lay awake at night staring at the ceiling. She had to have been real. I saw her every day. Didn't I? Then, a few days later, I met the old woman. She ran the tiny convenience store just down the street from the bus stop, the kind of place that still had a ringing bell over the door. I asked her the same question I'd asked the barista. And this time, she didn't look at me like I was crazy. She went very, very still. Her eyes flicked toward the window, toward the bus stop, and then back to me. "You mean the little girl?" she asked quietly. A surge of relief washed over me, finally. "Yes, you remember her?" The woman hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "That girl went missing years ago." Something cold unfurled in my chest. I let out a nervous laugh. No, I mean recently. She was just there a few weeks ago." The woman shook her head slowly. "She used to wait at that bus stop every morning," she murmured. "Then one day, she was gone. No one ever found her." I swallowed, my throat dry. "Are you sure?" Her eyes flicked to the window again. "You're not the first person to ask about her." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "Every few years," she said, "someone comes in, asking about that girl, and every time, no one else remembers her." A chill crept down my spine. I forced myself to smile, to laugh it off. "That's a little creepy." She just nodded. I left the store quickly, the automatic door shutting behind me with a hiss. The air outside felt too thick. I walked to the bus stop and stood there, staring at the empty sidewalk, at the spot where she used to stand. She had been real. I knew she had. Hadn't she? But if that was true, where was she now? And why was I the only one who remembered her? I couldn't let it go. I told myself I would. I told myself it didn't matter, that it wasn't my business, that I was obsessing over a stranger kid I never even spoke to. But I knew that was a lie, because something wasn't right. Every morning I found myself looking at that bus stop, expecting to see her there again, even though I knew she wouldn't be. It had become a habit, a compulsion. My mind replayed the same question over and over. Where did she go? Or worse, was she ever really there? That thought sat like a stone in my gut. The old woman's words haunted me. "You're not the first person to ask about her." What did that even mean? I started digging. It began with old news articles. I spent hours scrolling through archives, looking for anything about a missing girl from my town. There were a few cases over the years, runaways, tragic accidents, but none of them matched. None of them were her. The frustration gnawed at me. My memories of her were clear. I could picture her perfectly, her slightly oversized coat, the way she shifted on her feet, the way she never looked at her phone like the other kids. She had to exist. But then why couldn't I find a single piece of proof? I tried to push it out of my mind, but it followed me everywhere. At work, my fingers hovered over my keyboard, lost in thought. On my commute home, I felt a phantom presence beside me, like I should have been able to see her standing at that bus stop, waiting. One night, unable to sleep, I pulled out my phone and started searching social media. Nothing. No posts, no missing person flyers, no old classmates reminiscing about a friend who disappeared. But then I had a thought. The bus stop was right in front of a small grocery store, and stores had security cameras. I didn't even hesitate. The next day, I walked straight into the store and found the manager, a tired-looking man in his 40s with coffee stains on his shirt. "Hey," I said, as casually as possible. "I was wondering, do you keep security footage from the parking lot?" He frowned. "Why?" I hesitated. "I think I lost something near the bus stop a few weeks ago, just trying to check if I can spot it." It was a lie, but close enough to the truth. The manager scratched his chin. "We don't keep footage for long, maybe a month if nothing major happens. I can check." My pulse quickened as he led me to a small back office with a bank of security monitors. He clicked through some files, pulling up recorded footage from 3 weeks ago. I leaned in, my breath shallow. The screen showed the bus stop. I watched, anticipation curling in my stomach. The date in the corner of the screen matched the week I remembered seeing her last. The footage played. Morning commuters. A few cars pulling in and out of the parking lot. And then, me, standing at the bus stop, alone. I felt my chest tighten. "No, this isn't right. Go back." The manager rewound the footage, played it again. There I was, in the exact spot I always stood, talking to no one. A cold sweat broke out along my back. My legs felt weak. "Do you want me to check another day?" the manager asked, giving me a wary look. I nodded. My hands were clammy. He pulled up footage from the day before that. There I was again, standing at the bus stop, talking, gesturing, to empty space. A deep unease settled into my bones. "No," I whispered. The manager glanced at me. "You sure you're looking for something real, man?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because in the footage, I wasn't just standing there. I was smiling. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't just imagined the girl. I had interacted with her, engaged in conversations that, according to this footage, never happened. I stumbled out of the store, my stomach twisting, my head ached. I could feel the weight of the manager's eyes on me as I left, like he was watching a man unravel. I barely noticed the walk home. My body moved on autopilot, my mind spiraling. I knew what I saw. I knew she was real. But if she wasn't, if she had never been there then, who the hell had I been talking to? That night, I barely slept. My thoughts were a tangled mess, looping the same questions over and over. Had I hallucinated her? Was I losing my mind? At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Then, at 2:34 a.m., I woke up. A soft noise. A whisper. Right outside my window. I shot up in bed, heart hammering. The room was dark, shadows stretching long across the walls. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. But the feeling was there. That creeping, skin-crawling sensation of being watched. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. A shape, small, still, standing on the sidewalk just beyond the glow of the street lamp. My throat closed. I couldn't move. The shape shifted, stepped forward. The light caught her face. It was her, the missing girl. The girl no one remembered. The girl I had supposedly never spoken to. She stood motionless, her dark eyes locked onto mine through the glass. And then, she smiled. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just stared at her, at that impossible, unshakable presence standing on the sidewalk outside my window. The missing girl, the girl no one remembered, the girl I had supposedly never spoken to. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, her dark eyes locked onto mine through the glass. And then, she smiled. Something about it was wrong, not in a horror movie way, not twisted or unnatural, but in the way that made my stomach tighten. It was familiar, too familiar. I knew that smile. And then she raised a hand, slow, deliberate, and waved. Like she knew me. Like we were friends. The room felt unbearably small. My breathing was shallow, my pulse hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I needed to get out. Without taking my eyes off her, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. My fingers were damp with sweat. I fumbled to unlock it, but when I looked back up, she was gone. A shiver ran through me. I threw off my blankets, rushing to the window, scanning the sidewalk, the street, the empty yards. Nothing. She had vanished. I swallowed hard, stepping back from the glass, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was sleep-deprived, losing it, falling deeper into some obsessive spiral. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had seen her. She was real. And then my phone buzzed in my hand. A text. From an unknown number. Just 2 words. Remember me? A chill shot through me. My grip tightened around my phone. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to delete the message, shut my phone off, pretend none of this was happening. But I couldn't. So I did the only thing I could think of. I texted back, "Who are you?" The reply came instantly. Look deeper. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I did exactly what the message said. I looked deeper. I spent hours online, scouring old missing persons reports, searching every forum, every archived article. My head ached, my vision blurred, but I kept going. And then I found it. Not in a news report, not in a police database, but in an old school yearbook from my school. 15 years ago. My stomach twisted as I scrolled through the scanned pages. And then, there she was. The girl from the bus stop. Same face, same eyes. I stared at the page, barely breathing. My hands shook as I read her name. Samantha Caldwell. The name hit me like a punch. Caldwell. As in Mr. Caldwell. Rachel's dad. The man who had been arrested. The stalker. Number. No, that didn't make sense. I flipped through the yearbook, skimming for details, my pulse racing, and then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A memorial page. In loving memory of Samantha Caldwell. She had died the summer after that school year, drowned in a lake. Her father, Mr. Caldwell, had reported her missing, but the body wasn't found for weeks. By then, it was too late. I slammed the laptop shut, my head pounding. Samantha Caldwell, the girl no one else remembered, the girl I had seen every morning, the girl I had talked to. I ran a shaky hand down my face, forcing myself to think. This had to be a coincidence. I was sleep-deprived, paranoid, spiraling. Maybe I saw her picture years ago and it got stuck in my subconscious. Maybe I was just... My phone buzzed again. Another text. Now do you remember? I felt sick. I didn't know what this meant. I didn't want to. But something deep in my gut told me I had to find out. I needed proof. The next morning, I went to the one place I hadn't checked yet. City Records. It took some convincing, but I got a board clerk to pull old student attendance records from my school, ones dating back to when I would have been in kindergarten. And there, on the list, was my name. And hers. Samantha Caldwell. In my class. In my school. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a sensation like something just out of reach, just past the surface of my memory, something I couldn't grasp. Then I saw the footnote next to her name. Transferred mid-year. Transferred? But the yearbook said she died. My hands felt numb as I checked another set of records, my breath catching as I found another Samantha Caldwell listed at a different school in another town only, to be marked as withdrawn again. She had been moved. Again and again. Erased from one place, moved to another, then erased again. I had thought she was a ghost, a hallucination, a trick of my own mind. But Samantha Caldwell had been very, very real. Someone had tried to make sure she was forgotten, but I had remembered. And now, someone else knew I did. My phone buzzed one last time. Goodbye, Alex. I felt my blood turn to ice. I hadn't given anyone my name. I looked around. The air was still. The bus stop was empty. And I knew deep in my bones this was over. Whoever had been watching me, whoever had been making me remember, they were done. And for some reason I didn't want to know why. The cabin had been in our family for generations, tucked away in the dense forests of northern Montana. It was a place of memories of summers spent fishing in the lake, winters curled up by the fireplace, and long days where the outside world seemed to fade into silence. My dad loved it more than any of us. He used to say, "There's peace in the woods, Sam. You just have to listen for it." But now, at 17, I knew the silence wasn't always peaceful. It could feel empty, watching, waiting. I didn't always think that way, not until that last trip. That was the year it was just the three of us, my little brother Ben, and my dad. My mom had passed 2 years prior, and my older brother had moved out, leaving just us boys. Dad hadn't been the same since she was gone, but he refused to let go of the cabin. So, like every summer, we packed up the truck, loaded up with supplies, and made the long drive up the winding roads that led to Reed Lake. The drive took nearly 6 hours. I watched as the landscape shifted from highways to small-town roads, then finally to nothing but trees. By the time we arrived, the sun had already started to dip behind the mountains. The cabin looked exactly the same: weathered wood, a stone chimney, and windows that stared out at the wilderness like empty eyes. Something felt different, though. I shook it off. It was just the quiet. As soon as we stepped out, the smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. The place still had that wild, untouched feeling that I used to love as a kid. Ben jumped out of the truck, already excited to ride his dirt bike around the property. My dad stretched, breathing in the fresh air. "Feels good to be back," he said. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't so sure. We didn't have any real neighbors. The closest sign of life was an old hunting cabin a half-mile up the road. It had been there as long as I could remember. We'd never seen anyone live there. Dad said it belonged to a guy named Carl Jensen, a hunter who used to live off the land but disappeared years ago. The only thing that ever changed about the place was the yard. It should have been overgrown, abandoned. But every year, the grass was freshly cut. No sign of cars, no lights at night. Just freshly cut grass. It unsettled me, but my dad just shrugged. "Probably a ranger keeping it up," he said. I wasn't so sure. That night, after unloading our gear and making a fire, Dad decided to drive into town to grab a pizza. Ben immediately begged to go with him. I should have gone too. I should have gotten in the truck and left. Instead, I stayed behind. It was fine at first. I threw myself onto the couch, flipping through 3 lousy channels on the ancient television. But then the sun started to set. The cabin had big windows. At night, they turned into black mirrors. I hated them. The light from inside made it impossible to see anything outside, but if any non or anything was out there watching, they'd have a clear view of me. I tried not to think about it. Tried not to imagine eyes in the dark. I got up to shut the blinds, except the cabin didn't have real blinds. Just thin, useless curtains that barely covered half the window. I felt exposed. I was about to sit back down when something outside moved. A shadow. Not an animal, not the wind, something tall. My stomach dropped. I told myself I was imagining things, a trick of the light. Then, knock, knock. I jumped so hard I nearly tripped over the coffee table. The sound had come from the front door. I stood there, paralyzed. No one was supposed to be out here. We were miles from the nearest town. No cell service. No reason for anyone to show up unannounced. Knock, knock. I clenched my fists. Think, Sam. Dad and Ben wouldn't knock. They'd just come inside. And who else would be out here? I forced my legs to move, creeping toward the window by the door. Slowly, I peered outside. No one was there. The porch was empty. Just the dense, black woods beyond it. I swallowed hard. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe. Then I saw it. The note. A single piece of paper, taped to the wooden railing outside. I hesitated. Then, heart hammering, I opened the door just enough to grab it before slamming it shut again. I unfolded the paper with shaking hands. 4 words, scrawled in messy, hurried handwriting. If you hear it, run. The air in the cabin felt too thick. My breathing came fast. This was a joke. It had to be. A prank from some hunter, some idiot messing with campers. But then I noticed something. The paper was damp, fresh. It hadn't been sitting out long. Whoever left it was still nearby. A wave of nausea rolled over me. I locked every door, turned off every light, and sat there in the darkness, gripping the note, waiting. I sat in the dark, gripping the note, my pulse hammering so hard it echoed in my ears. If you hear it, run. I wanted to believe this was some prank, some local messing with outsiders, but deep down, I knew better. Because no one was out here. No one should be out here. I checked the time. My dad and Ben had only been gone for about 20 minutes. It would take at least an hour before they got back. And I was alone. I sat still, listening. The only sound was the wind brushing against the cabin walls, the faint creaking of the old wooden beams settling in the cold. Nothing else. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, watching, waiting. I checked the locks again, peering through the narrow gap in the curtains. The porch was empty, the road leading to the cabin nothing. I turned my gaze to the trees. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line. My stomach twisted into knots. It wasn't moving, not shifting, not adjusting its stance, just standing there. A tall, thin silhouette, barely visible in the dim moonlight. I squinted, my breath shallow. It almost looked like a person, but something was wrong. Their proportions were off, arms too long, the head tilted at an unnatural angle, like someone trying to mimic a human shape but getting it slightly wrong. I blinked. It was gone. A cold sweat broke out across my back. I hadn't looked away. But somehow, in that single moment, it had vanished. I stepped back from the window, my hands clammy. I needed to stay calm, think rationally. It was dark. I was tired. I had probably just imagined its shadows playing tricks on me. But that note, that damn note. Someone else had seen something too. Someone had left a warning just for me. I told myself I'd stay inside, lock up, sit tight, and wait for my dad to get back. And that would have been the smart thing to do. But then I heard it. A voice. Soft, distant, coming from the trees. Sam? I froze. My blood turned to ice. It sounded like Ben. But wrong. Something about it was off. The tone was flat, missing that natural lilt of human speech. Like someone imitating a voice, but not quite nailing it. Sam, help me. It was closer now. Number. Ben was with my dad, miles away. There was no way he was in those woods. A knot of fear twisted in my gut. I remembered the note. If you hear Itron. My hands shook. My mind screamed at me to listen, to lock myself in the bathroom or crawl under the bed and wait. But my legs wouldn't move. Instead, I did the worst thing I could have done. I answered. Ben? Silence. My heart pounded. I took a slow step toward the door, then another. I was shaking so bad I could barely breathe. Then, a sound. Something running, barreling through the trees, moving fast. I sucked in a sharp breath, stumbling backward. Then bang. The front door shook violently, like something had slammed into it full force. I screamed. Another bang. The door rattled on its hinges. I ran. I ran straight to my dad's room and slammed the door shut, locking it. My hands scrambled in the dark, searching for something, anything I could use as a weapon. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps outside the door. And then, the doorknob turned. I nearly choked on my own breath. The lock held, but the knob twisted back and forth, slowly, methodically. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to break in. It was waiting. Testing. My body locked up. I was too terrified to move. Then, Sam? I stopped breathing. Because this time, it was my dad's voice. Sam, it's me. Open the door. The doorknob rattled again. My hands clenched into fists. Number. It wasn't him. It was the same voice from the woods. It was just using his voice now. A tightness clawed up my throat. I wanted to cry. I didn't. Instead, I forced my legs to move, backing away from the door. Bang. A single, final hit against the wood. Then, silence. No footsteps. No voices. Nothing. I stood there, shaking, listening. Then, from outside, the sound of a car approaching. My dad. The real one. I barely had time to process it before I heard the truck pull up, tires crunching on the gravel. A car door slammed. Sam, my dad's voice, his real voice. I bolted. I ran out of the bedroom, through the hallway, and toward the front door only to stop cold. The front door was wide open. No sign of forced entry. Just open. Like someone had walked right in. Like someone had walked right out. I turned, scanning the room. Nothing. No sign that anything had been there. Except for the note. I still had it, clenched in my fist. My dad's footsteps pounded onto the porch, followed by Ben's voice. Sam, what's going on? I turned, staring at them, at their confused expressions, at the warm glow of the truck's headlights spilling onto the porch. For a second, I thought I imagined it all. But then I saw something, just past my dad's shoulder. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line, watching. My stomach sank. I wanted to tell him, wanted to say something, but I didn't, because the figure wasn't there anymore. It was gone, just like before. And deep down, I knew. It wasn't finished with me yet. The night felt heavier than before. Even with my dad and Ben back, the feeling hadn't left that tight, suffocating weight in my chest, like something was still watching, waiting just beyond the edge of the light. I barely spoke as we sat at the small wooden table inside the cabin, the weak glow of the single overhead bulb casting deep shadows on the walls. The pizza they brought back sat untouched in front of me. My dad noticed. "You all right, Sam?" I hesitated. Should I tell him? Tell him about the note, the voice, the knocking. I glanced at Ben, shoving a slice of pizza into his mouth like nothing had happened. I didn't want to scare him. I didn't want to sound crazy. "Yeah," I muttered, forcing a weak smile. "Just tired." Dad didn't look convinced, but he let it go. Ben kept talking, something about his dirt bike, how he wanted to ride it out to the old ranger station down the road tomorrow. I wasn't listening. I was thinking about the door, how it had been open when they got back, how it hadn't been forced or broken. Had I locked it? I was sure I did. But what if I didn't? What if something had been inside while I was locked in that bedroom? I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting. I needed to sleep, needed to shake this feeling. Maybe I really was just on edge. Maybe. But deep down, I knew better. That night, my dad and Ben shared the queen-sized bed, and I took the small bedroom in the back, the one with the window facing the woods. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening. Every creak in the cabin made my muscles tighten. Every gust of wind against the trees made my heart pound. But nothing came. No knocking. No voices. Eventually, exhaustion won, and my eyelids grew heavy. I slipped into sleep. Then, at some point in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. A soft tapping. Not on the front door. On the window. The window right next to my bed. I felt my breath freeze in my lungs. Tap, tap. Slow, deliberate. I clenched my hands into fists beneath the blanket. I couldn't move. Couldn't bring myself to turn my head toward the glass. I knew it was there, watching me, waiting for me to look. Tap, tap. I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood. A slow creak sounded from the window frame, like something was pressing against it, testing it. I clenched my jaw. Don't move, don't look, don't breathe, and don't respond. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, a whisper, right outside the window. "Sam, open the window." My entire body locked up, because it was my own voice. I felt bile rise in my throat. It wasn't me. It wasn't real. But it sounded exactly like me, flat, hollow, missing something human. "Sam." Closer. "Let me in." I squeezed my eyes shut, heart hammering. This was a dream. It had to be a dream. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out. Then, the doorknob rattled. The bedroom door. Inside the cabin, a choked breath escaped my lips. Number no, no, no. The window was one thing. But the door meant something had gotten in. And I didn't hear it. The air pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. I wanted to scream for my dad, but the words were stuck in my throat. Then I did the only thing I could. I turned my head just enough to see the door handle slowly turning. The lock held. but something was trying to get in. Something was inside the cabin with us. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the blanket like it could protect me. And then, silence. No knocking, no whispers, just nothing. I stayed like that, curled up and shaking, until the first hints of dawn crept through the window. The moment I saw sunlight, I shot up from bed, stumbling toward the door. It was still locked, but there were scratches on the wood. Thin, deep scratches, like something had been clawing at it. My breath came fast and uneven. I needed to tell my dad. I needed to. A sound outside made me freeze. Footsteps. Slow, crunching footsteps on the gravel. I turned, moving toward the window. Something was walking toward the cabin. My dad, but something was wrong. His gait was stiff, wrong. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. He stopped just a few feet from the porch. Then, he looked up and smiled. It wasn't him. It had his face, his build, his clothes. But it wasn't him. The eyes were wrong. They weren't my dad's. They weren't anyone's. They were empty. Then, without moving his lips, I heard his voice. "Sam, come outside." My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back from the window. Then, the front door creaked open. I turned. My real dad was standing in the doorway, still half asleep, rubbing his eyes. "Sam, who are you talking to?" I spun back to the window. The thing was gone. I gasped, chest rising and falling in sharp, shaking breaths. My dad stepped into the room, confused. "What's wrong?" I couldn't speak. I just looked at him, at his real eyes, the warmth in them, the exhaustion. It was really him. But something else had been here. Something else had worn his face. And I had almost answered it. I stood there, my breath shallow, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The thing that looked like my dad was gone. Vanished, like it had never been there at all. But it had been. And I had almost answered it. My dad rubbed his eyes, still groggy. "Sam, what's going on?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My throat felt tight, dry. What could I say? That I had just watched something wearing his face standing in the yard, smiling up at me. He'd think I was losing it. But I wasn't. I knew what I saw. Ben shuffled out of the bedroom behind him, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Why are you guys up so early?" I turned back to the window, half expecting to see that thing standing there again. The yard was empty. Just trees. The forest stretching out into the horizon, dark and endless. I swallowed hard. I stopped myself. Number. I wasn't going to say anything. Not yet. Because if I did, they'd shrug it off. They'd tell me I was imagining things. And if I was right, if something was out there then, that's exactly what it wanted. For them to let their guard down. For them to answer. "Nothing," I finally muttered. "I just had a bad dream." My dad gave me a long look, like he didn't quite believe me. But then he sighed. "Well, I need some coffee before we do anything." Ben perked up. Can I go ride the dirt bike? Dad waved him off. Yeah, just stay near the property. Ben grinned and ran outside before I could stop him. I watched him sprint toward his dirt bike, firing it up with a loud rev. And suddenly, a horrible, gut-wrenching thought hit me. What if it called his name? Would he answer? Would it trick him like it almost tricked me? Panic flared in my chest. Ben, wait. I started toward the door, but it was too late. He was already peeling off down the dirt road, disappearing behind the tree line. I stood frozen in the doorway, heart hammering, the sound of his engine fading into the distance. My dad sipped his coffee behind me. You're acting weird, kid. You sure you're okay? I forced myself to nod, but I wasn't. I wasn't okay at all. The neighbor's house. The morning dragged. I tried to act normal. I really did. I helped Dad stack some firewood, cleaned up the kitchen, anything to keep my mind off last night. But I couldn't stop thinking about Ben. He had been gone too long, and no one seemed to care but me. I checked my watch. Nearly an hour. Way too long for him to just be riding loops around the cabin. I set the axe down, wiping sweat from my forehead. I'm going to go check on Ben, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad barely looked up from the wood pile. He's fine. You know how he-ish gets distracted. I clenched my jaw. Still, I'll be back soon. I grabbed a flashlight, even though it was broad daylight, and started walking. The dirt road was quiet, the only sound my footsteps against the gravel. I scanned the trees, searching for any sign of his dirt bike tracks. Nothing. I picked up the pace. Then, up ahead past a curve in the road, I saw it. Ben's dirt bike, lying on its side. The engine was still warm. My stomach plummeted. Ben? No response. I turned in a slow circle, skin prickling. There was only one place nearby he could have gone, the old neighbor's house. The one no one was supposed to live in. The one with the freshly cut grass. And the open door. My hands went clammy. The door was wide open. I stepped forward, my throat tightening. The place looked abandoned, like no one had lived there for decades. Windows coated in dust, paint peeling from the walls, the front steps slightly warped and sagging from rain. But someone had been here. Someone had left the door open. And I had a sinking feeling that Ben had gone inside. Ben? I called, stepping onto the porch. Still nothing. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside the house, the air inside was stale, rotting, like old wood and something worse. The living room was small, dusty furniture, a broken television, an old wooden table, no sign of Ben. I moved forward, my footsteps too loud. The kitchen was worse. Empty, ransacked, a few rotting food containers left open on the counter, a moldy plate in the sink. It didn't make sense. Why would he come in here? Ben, I called again, voice shaking. Then, a sound from down the hall. Something shifting. I turned, pulse hammering. A single door stood at the end of the hallway. Slightly open. I swallowed. Ben? Nothing. I stepped closer. The air grew heavier. The hallway smelled damp, like earth, like something had been buried. I reached the door, my fingers hesitating on the edge. Then, I pushed it open. A staircase, leading down, a basement. My breath hitched. I felt it before I even stepped down. Something was down there, waiting. A chill ran through me. I didn't want to go down. Every instinct screamed not to. But I had to find Ben. So, I forced myself forward. The stairs creaked beneath my weight. The light was dim just, a single, bare bulb flickering above. I stepped off the last stair, and then I saw them. Hooks, hanging from the ceiling. My stomach lurched. Some were empty, some had things on them. I couldn't tell what, old clothes maybe, pieces of something that looked too dark to be fabric. Then, a breath, right behind me. I spun around, and there he was, Ben, standing in the middle of the room. His face pale, eyes wide. His arms had deep cuts, still bleeding. Ben, I whispered, stepping toward him. He didn't move, didn't blink. Then, slowly, he smiled. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't him. I knew it wasn't him. Because as he stood there, grinning, something shifted behind him. And I saw it. The real Ben. Hunched in the corner, shaking, terrified. My breath caught. The thing in front of me, the thing pretending to be my brother, took a step forward. Ben was still smiling, but it wasn't him. I knew it. I could feel it in my bones, in the pit of my stomach. The real Benthay, shaking, terrified version of him was still huddled in the corner, eyes locked onto the thing standing in front of me. The thing that looked like him. The air in the basement felt thick, pressing against my chest like I was suffocating. The fake Ben took another step forward. I moved back. Slowly, carefully. The light above flickered. The room was too still, too wrong. And then it spoke. Sam, it said. My own brother's voice, perfectly copied. A shiver crawled down my spine. The real Ben whimpered behind it, silent, shaking. I had to get to him. But the thing stood between us. I forced myself to speak. Ben? My voice was barely above a whisper. The wrong one grinned wider. Yeah? A response. That's what it wanted. It wanted me to acknowledge it. To believe it. And I almost did. Almost. But then I noticed something. Its feet. It wasn't standing. Not really. It was hovering just an inch above the ground, as if it had never quite figured out how gravity worked. My chest tightened. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, without warning, it lunged. I barely had time to react. I threw myself to the side, hitting the ground hard. The thing screeched, its voice warping Ben's voice, twisting into something else entirely. I scrambled toward the real Ben, grabbing his arm, shaking him. Ben, we need to go now. He barely responded, his body limp with fear. The thing was already turning toward us. I had no plan, no weapon, no time. So I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed Ben by the shirt and ran. We tore through the basement, past the rusted hooks, past the piles of God knows what, toward the stairs. But the thing was faster. It glided toward us, moving in sharp, unnatural jerks, its limbs twisting like a puppet on tangled strings. I yanked Ben up the stairs, my legs burning. The moment we reached the top, I slammed the door shut, locking it. We sprinted through the house, past the dusty furniture, the peeling wallpaper, and then we heard it. A noise I will never forget. The sound of it laughing. Slow, low, like it had all the time in the world. I threw open the front door, dragging Ben with me. The sunlight hit us like a slap, the warm air so jarringly normal that for half a second I almost thought we were safe. But we weren't. Not yet. We had to get to the cabin. I grabbed Ben's dirt bike from where it had fallen in the dirt, forcing his hands onto the handles. "Ride," I told him, my voice shook. "Ride back to Dad. Don't stop. Don't answer if you hear me calling. Do you understand?" Ben didn't respond. "Do you understand?" His head snapped up, eyes wide and wet with terror. He nodded. And then, without another word, he kicked the bike into gear and tore down the road. I turned. I had to be sure. Had to see it. But when I looked back at the house, the door was closed, like it had never been open at all, like it was waiting for the next person to make a mistake. A single note had been nailed to the door. The same handwriting, the same warning. "If you hear it, run." I didn't hesitate. I ran. Dad was already outside when we arrived. Ben must have beaten me back by a few minutes because he was already off the dirt bike, sitting on the porch, shaking. Dad took one look at me and knew something was wrong. What the hell happened? I could barely breathe. Ben was crying now. I turned to my dad, gripping his arm. "We have to leave." Dad frowned. "What are you?" "Now." My voice cracked. I had never begged him for anything in my life. He must have seen something in my face because his expression hardened. Without another word, he turned and went inside. We packed in under 10 minutes. The whole time, I kept my eyes on the trees, on the shadows between them, because I knew it was still out there, still watching, waiting, and it would wait as long as it had to. We didn't stop until we hit the highway. Dad didn't ask questions. Not until we were miles away, surrounded by other cars, other people. What happened back there? I opened my mouth, then closed it. What was I supposed to say? That there was something in the woods? That it had tried to steal my brother's face? That it had already stolen others before us? I couldn't, because even if I told him, it wouldn't change the fact that it was still out there. So I just said, "We can't go back." Dad exhaled slowly, gripping the wheel tighter. "All right," he said. And that was that. We never spoke about it again. The cabin was sold within a year. Ben and I grew up, moved on, but even now, years later, I still dream about that place. I still hear it. The knocking. The voice that sounds just like mine. And sometimes, just before I wake up, I hear it whisper, "Sam, let me in." I never liked my grandma's house. It wasn't that it was dirty or cluttered or smelled of old people like some might expect. No, it was just too quiet. Located on the edge of town, her house sat alone at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by an overgrown garden that she insisted was natural and full of character. To me, it just looked like something hiding places. The house itself was a small two-story cottage. The kitchen and living room took up most of the downstairs, with a conservatory attached to the back, full of dusty armchairs and creeping ivy. The conservatory had glass walls giving an open view of the garden, which stretched into the darkness. Upstairs, my grandma's bedroom was on the left, with a small guest bedroom on the right, where I was staying for the night. The only bathroom was at the end of the hall. It wasn't a big place, but it felt empty in a way that didn't feel right. I was staying the night because my grandma, a tough 61-year-old woman who still fixed her own plumbing and refused to ask for help, had asked me to help with some repairs the next morning. I agreed, thinking I'd get a warm meal and a good night's sleep out of it. I was wrong. I heard the first noise around 10:30 p.m. Grandma had gone upstairs to get ready for bed, leaving me in the living room, watching television. I had the volume low, but even over it, I could hear a faint rustling noise coming from the conservatory. At first, I thought it was the wind pushing against the glass, maybe some branches scratching at the windows. But as I muted the television and listened closer, the sound became a soft tapping, like fingertips against the glass. I turned to look. The conservatory was dark, barely illuminated by the light from the living room. The glass walls reflected the room back at me, making it hard to see outside. But I had the unshakable feeling that someone was out there. I told myself it was just a tree branch and went back to watching television. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I woke up to a creaking sound. It was slow, rhythmic, deliberate. I blinked, disoriented, the television screen now dimmed. The creaking was coming from upstairs, followed by a soft whispering. I sighed, rubbing my face. It had to be Grandma on the phone. She had a habit of talking to her sister late at night, pacing around her room while she gossiped. But something felt off. The whispers were too quiet, like they weren't meant to be heard, and the creaking, it wasn't the normal pattern of pacing footsteps. It sounded like someone rocking back and forth. I sat up slowly, trying not to make a sound. The house was cold. My skin prickled as I stood and crept toward the staircase. The whispering continued. I stepped into the hallway, peering up the stairs. The creaking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a sharp, wet whisper came from the darkness above. "Austin, where is Austin?" I froze. That wasn't Grandma's voice. A shadow shifted at the top of the stairs. My heart pounded as I reached for the light switch, flicking it on. And that's when I saw her. She was tall, too tall, at least 6 feet, maybe more. Her body was emaciated, her skin stretched too tightly over her bones, veins webbing across her arms and chest. And she was completely naked. Her head twitched violently as she mumbled to herself, her thin lips moving rapidly, repeating the same question over and over. Austin. Where is Austin? I took a step back. Her head snapped toward me. And then she screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound full of rage and grief, like an animal in pain. She lurched forward, her bare feet slapping against the wood as she lunged toward me. I barely had time to react before I slammed the living room door shut in her face. She hit the door hard, her nails scraping against the wood, her voice rising in a frenzy. Where is Austin? Where is Austin? I stumbled backward, breathless, my hands shaking. And then boom. Something heavy crashed upstairs. Another set of footsteps thundered down the hall. James! It was Grandma. She burst into the room, her nightgown billowing, eyes blazing with fury. Without hesitation, she marched to the door and yanked it open. The woman was still there, panting, hunched over, her eyes wild and sunken. And then, something changed. The second Grandma appeared, the woman's entire body tensed, her eyes widened in terror, and she stumbled backward, her thin arms trembling. Grandma pointed a shaking finger at her, her voice firm. Get out. The woman let out a low, desperate whimper and then she ran. She bolted through the conservatory, her bare feet thudding against the floor, and then out the back door, disappearing into the darkness. The moment she was gone, Grandma turned to me, her expression unreadable. Are you hurt? She asked. I shook my head. She sighed. Lock the doors. We'll talk in the morning. And just like that, she went upstairs, leaving me standing there, shaken and confused. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, Grandma made breakfast like nothing had happened. I waited until she sat down with her coffee before finally asking, Who the hell was that? Grandma stirred her coffee slowly, as if picking her words carefully. Years ago, she said, a woman used to live in the old house across the field. Her son went missing, Austin. Just vanished one day. She never recovered from it. She took a sip of coffee. Some nights, she comes looking for him. I stared at her. That woman, she was alive? Grandma gave me a long, tired look. Of course she was, she said. Wouldn't have run otherwise. I felt cold all over. That meant she was still out there, still wandering the woods, still looking for Austin. And now she knew my name. I always knew something was wrong with my sister. Not in a cruel way, not in a she's crazy way, just different. She was always a little offbeat, a little too sensitive, a little too lost in her own head. When we were kids, she had imaginary friends way longer than normal. She'd talk to them for hours, whispering in corners, pausing to listen like someone was actually answering her. We thought it was just a phase. It wasn't. By the time she was 14, the conversations had turned into paranoia. She'd tell me about voices whispering in the walls, shadows moving in places they shouldn't. I shrugged it off. I was her older brother. That's what I did. She was my little sister, my responsibility, and I wasn't about to encourage whatever was happening in her head. My parents, though, they were worried. They took her to doctors, therapists, specialists. Words like psychosis, auditory hallucinations, and delusional thinking were thrown around. They put her on medication. It worked mostly. until she stopped taking it. Now she's 17, I'm 19, and our family is just trying to hold things together. We live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with neatly trimmed hedges, old streetlights that flicker at night, and a long, winding road that stretches into nothing. The houses are close together but distant in feeling. We have neighbors, but they keep to themselves, the kind of people who close their blinds when they see something strange. At night, it feels empty, too quiet. Sometimes I stand outside on the porch and just listen. There's no traffic, no dogs barking, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. But my sister, she hears more than that. She sleeps in the room across the hall from me. It's small, cluttered, full of half-finished paintings, stacks of books, and notebooks with unreadable scribbles she never lets me see. Our parents work late, a lot. It's just the two of us most nights. And lately, she's been getting worse. It started with footsteps. Not real ones, at least. Not that I ever heard. One night, she knocked on my door looking pale. I think someone's in the house. I sighed, rubbing my eyes. You didn't take your meds, did you? She shook her head quickly. No, listen, I hear them every night, pacing outside my room. I sat up. Mom and Dad, they're not home. I frowned, listening. Silence. No footsteps, no creaking, just the quiet hum of the house settling. She bit her lip, arms crossed over herself. It sounds like someone walking up and down the hall, over and over. I stood up, walked past her, and checked. Nothing. See? It's fine. She hesitated before mumbling, "It stops when you come out." I rolled my eyes. Go to bed. You're freaking yourself out. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue either. I should have paid attention to how tired she looked, how the dark circles under her eyes had deepened. Instead, I just went back to sleep. The next night, she heard whispers. She banged on my door, frantic this time. "There's someone outside my window." I groaned. "Seriously?" She grabbed my wrist, pulling me toward her room. I looked out. Nothing. The street was empty, the houses dark, the sky a murky black with no moon. There was a voice, she insisted, right outside my window. A man. He was whispering my name. I rubbed my temples. "It's in your head, okay? You have to take your meds." She shook her head, stepping back. "I know what I heard." "You don't," I said, harsher than I meant. "It's the same thing every time, and it's never real. Just go to bed." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't place. It wasn't anger. It was fear. The noises got worse. 3 nights later, I found her sitting in the living room at 3 a.m., hugging her knees, staring at the ceiling. "The walls are breathing," she whispered. I sighed. "They're not." She squeezed her eyes shut. "You don't understand." She wouldn't go back to her room that night. She slept on the couch. I didn't push her. I figured it was one of her episodes. I figured she'd be fine. Then last night, I woke up to the sound of her door creaking open. Not a knock. Not her calling my name. Just the slow, quiet groan of wood bending under movement. I sat up, rubbing my face. What now? No answer. I sighed and stood, stepping into the hallway. Her door was open. Her room was dark. I hesitated, feeling a weird, uneasy chill crawl up my spine. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, completely still, her back to me. I frowned. "Hey, you okay?" She didn't move. I walked closer, cautiously. "Did you hear something again?" She nodded, barely. "What was it?" She turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see her face in the dim glow from the hallway. She looked distant, like she was listening. "Inside," she whispered. I felt cold. Inside what? She swallowed. "The cupboard." My eyes flicked to the old wooden cabinet in the corner of her room. She never used it. It was practically empty. But something about it. The door was slightly ajar, like it had been opened just a crack. I exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of my neck. "There's nothing in there." She shook her head. "Something's inside." I sighed, forcing myself to act normal. I didn't want to feed her delusions. So I walked up to the cupboard, grabbed the handle, and pulled it open. Empty. I turned back to her. "See?" She finally looked at me and whispered, "He's hiding." I didn't sleep much after that. I told myself it was just in her head, that she needed to be back on her meds, that it was just another bad night. But something about the way she said it, so calm, so certain, stuck with me. And tonight I'm hearing things too. I woke up to the sound of breathing. Slow, uneven. Not my sister's. Not mine. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The air in my room felt thicker, like I was suddenly hyper-aware of how alone I was. I turned my head toward the hallway. The breathing wasn't coming from my room. It was coming from hers. I sat up, listening. It was faint, just past the edge of hearing, like someone trying not to make noise. Then a soft creak. My stomach dropped. I threw off the blanket and stood, moving carefully, slowly. The floorboards barely groaned under my weight as I stepped into the hallway. Her bedroom door was open, not wide, just a few inches, as if it had been pushed open gently. A dim glow from outside crept through her window, casting shadows along the walls. And then I saw it. The cupboard door, slightly ajar, open just a crack. The breathing was coming from inside. I wanted to believe it was her. I wanted to believe she was just having another episode, sitting inside like a child hiding from the dark. But then I heard her. She was in bed. She whispered, voice shaking, "James, he's inside." I felt my skin crawl. I wanted to run. I wanted to grab her, drag her out of that room and lock the door behind us. But I didn't move, because at that moment, the breathing changed. It wasn't quiet anymore. It was closer, louder, like whoever or whatever was inside the cupboard had just realized we were awake, and was now listening to us. The next sound I heard wasn't breathing. It was a shift, a slow, deliberate adjustment. The sound of bare skin dragging against wood. My hands clenched into fists. I reached out, barely whispering, "Stay behind me." She grabbed onto my wrist, squeezing so tightly I could feel her nails digging into my skin. I stepped forward. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it. But I did. The cupboard door swung open, and he was there. A tall, naked man, crouched inside, knees pressed up against his chest. He was too thin, his ribs protruding beneath pale, sickly skin, his arms too long, fingers curled like claws. His eyes snapped to mine, wide, unblinking, hollow, and then he smiled. Not like someone caught in the act, not embarrassed. A slow, stretched grin. A grin that said, "I've been waiting for you to find me." For one horrible second, we just stared at each other. My brain refused to make sense of what I was seeing. Then he spoke. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, like he hadn't spoken in weeks. "Austin," he rasped. My blood turned to ice. His body twitched violently, like he was trying to unfold himself from the cramped space. Then he lunged. I don't remember grabbing my sister. I don't remember turning and running. But suddenly, we were in the hallway, slamming her bedroom door behind us. The sound of bare feet slapping against the floor sent terror straight through me. I could hear him moving fast. I shoved my sister toward the stairs. "Run." She hesitated for a second too long, because at that moment, the bedroom door slammed open. Grandma was awake. She stormed out of her room, hair wild, fury in her eyes. And without a second of hesitation, she charged. "Get out of my house." I'd never seen her move so fast. And he froze. For the first time, the man looked afraid. Grandma grabbed the nearest thing, a lamp, and swung it. The base cracked against his ribs. The smile disappeared. He stumbled backward, scrambling for the door. And then he ran. The cops came 20 minutes later. They searched the whole neighborhood. No sign of him. Nothing except handprints on the inside of the cupboard, as if he had been pressing against it every night, listening, waiting. We found out later that the back door had been unlocked. And that cupboard? It had a false panel in the back. He had been hiding behind the wall. How long had he been in there? Days, weeks? Had he been the one whispering at night? Had he been watching my sister sleep? Had he been waiting for something? Waiting for Austin? I don't know. And I don't want to. We moved out. Grandma changed the locks before selling the house. We never talked about it again. My sister started taking her meds again. She sleeps fine now. But me, I still wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like something is watching me. Like something is hiding, listening, waiting. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts. Or at least, I wasn't. My name is Owen Carter. I've spent most of my life building a respectable career in architecture, working with high-end developers to reshape skylines and leave my mark on the world. I've always considered myself practical, logical, a man who deals with blueprints and concrete, not myths and legends. But some things defy logic. Some things refuse to stay buried. I never told anyone about what happened when I was a kid. Not my wife, not my co-workers, not even my closest friends. I've spent decades pretending it never happened, convincing myself that I was just young, impressionable, making things up. And yet, I still wake up some nights, drenched in sweat, feeling something breathing at the foot of my bed. I can still hear it whispering. This is the story of how I lost my brother. I grew up in a small town in northern Maine, the kind of place where the trees stretch for miles. The winters are unforgiving, and kids have to invent their own fun. There weren't shopping malls or big amusement parks, just dense forests and old abandoned houses that held the kind of mysteries children couldn't resist. It was the early 90s, before smartphones and constant supervision. My older brother, Caleb, was 12, and I was 10. Our younger sister, Emily, was 8. We were close, the kind of siblings who got into trouble together, dared each other to do stupid things, and spent our summers exploring every inch of our neighborhood. One summer, Caleb heard about a game from one of the older kids at school, something called the penny game. It's like a magic 8-ball, he explained, pulling a wrinkled piece of notebook paper from his backpack. You ask a question, and the spirits answer. Emily wrinkled her nose. That's stupid. Caleb ignored her. He grabbed a penny from the counter, smoothing out the paper on the kitchen table. He had written the alphabet across the top, along with yes and no at the corners. All we do, he said, placing the penny in the middle, is rest our fingers on it and ask a question. I hesitated. I wasn't sure why, but something about it made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way Caleb looked so determined, his fingers gripping the edge of the table like he was waiting for something to happen. It's just a game, he said. So we played. The first few times nothing happened. We asked stupid questions. Will we be rich? Does Emily have a secret boyfriend? And when the penny finally moved, it was barely more than a slow crawl across the page. Yes, it spelled. We laughed. We kept playing. It became a thing we did on rainy afternoons, huddled in Caleb's room with nothing better to do. Then, one day, everything changed. It was late, the sky outside a heavy gray, rain hammering against the windows. Our parents had gone out to dinner, leaving us alone for the evening. Emily was watching cartoons in the living room, uninterested in our little ritual. Caleb and I sat at the table, the paper spread between us. Caleb grinned. Want to ask it something creepy? I swallowed. Like what? He thought for a second. Then, pressing his fingers lightly on the penny, he whispered, "Who are you?" The penny didn't move at first. Then, slowly, painfully, it dragged across the page. H. U. N. G. R. Yai. A chill ran down my spine. Caleb frowned. Hungry for what? The penny twitched. Then, with unnatural speed, it shot across the page. M. E. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, from somewhere behind us, deep in the shadows of the kitchen, came a noise. A low, guttural growl. We did not own a dog. My entire body locked up. Caleb went pale. I saw his hands trembling as he reached for the paper, crumpling it in his fists. Nope, we're done. His voice was forced, strained. It's just a stupid game. He grabbed the paper and tossed it in the sink, fumbling for the matches our dad kept in the cabinet. With shaking hands, he lit the edges, watching the flames curl around the paper. When it was nothing but blackened scraps, he turned on the faucet and let the water wash it away. The room felt lighter. I exhaled, trying to laugh it off. Well, that was weird. Caleb forced a grin. Guess we won't be playing that again. And we didn't. At least not for a while. A few weeks later, everything changed. Our dad got a promotion, and we packed up our lives to move to a new town in Massachusetts. It was bigger, busier, and full of new opportunities. Emily was thrilled. Caleb was indifferent. But I noticed something was different about him. He stopped sleeping. At night, I would hear him shifting in his bed, tossing, turning, whispering under his breath. Sometimes, when I woke up to go to the bathroom, I'd see him sitting up, staring at the door, his hands gripping his blanket so tight his knuckles were white. "What's wrong with you?" I asked one morning. He looked at me, and I finally saw it. The dark circles under his eyes, the sunken look in his face, the sheer exhaustion. "It comes to my room," he whispered. I frowned. "What does?" Caleb swallowed. "The thing we talked to." I felt my stomach drop. "You're just having nightmares," I said, trying to sound rational. Caleb shook his head. "Number, I can hear it breathing, Owen. It stands by my bed. I feel the mattress dip when it leans in. It keeps saying the same thing over and over." I hesitated. "What does it say?" His voice was barely above a breath. "Feed me." I felt cold all over. For the first time, I looked at my brother and saw real fear. I wanted to tell him it was all in his head, that it was just his imagination. But something about the way he said it, the way his voice trembled, it made my skin crawl. "What do you want to do?" I finally asked. Caleb took a slow breath. "We need to talk to it." I felt my pulse quicken. "Are you insane?" "Number, this time we do it right. We get rid of it for good." I didn't argue, because deep down, I was terrified he was right. That was on a Monday. By Friday night, our parents were out for the evening. Emily was watching television upstairs. Caleb and I sat at the dining table. The Ouija board lay before us. I struck a match to light the candles. The flame went out instantly. I struck another. Gone. The third time, it stayed lit. We placed our fingers on the planchette. Caleb took a breath, and we began. The candle flames flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the trees and making the old house creak as if it were alive. The Ouija board sat between us, the letters stark against the wooden surface. Caleb placed his fingers on the planchette first, nodding for me to do the same. I hesitated. Everything in me screamed that this was a mistake, but I pressed my fingers against the smooth plastic anyway. "Okay," Caleb whispered. "We do this carefully. We follow the rules." I swallowed hard. "And if it answers?" "Then we tell it to go away." It sounded simple enough, but something inside me knew that once we started, there would be no turning back. Caleb took a breath and spoke. "Is there a spirit here with us?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette twitched. A slow, dragging movement so faint I almost convinced myself it was just our hands shaking. But then it moved again, deliberate and steady. Yai. E.S. A chill ran down my spine. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" The planchette jerked sharply, faster this time. H. U. N. G. R. Yai. My fingers trembled. Caleb swallowed hard, What do you want? The answer came before he finished the question. F. O. O. D. Caleb shot me a glance. I could see the struggle on his face, his logical mind wrestling with the undeniable truth of what was happening. I wanted to throw the board across the room to break the planchette in half to stop whatever this was before it got worse. Instead, Caleb asked, "What kind of food?" The planchette hesitated. Then it spelled M. E. A. T. The word sent a sickening wave through my stomach. I could feel something watching us. Not in the casual way you feel eyes on you in a crowded room, but something deeper, more primal, like a presence pressing in from the edges of the room, unseen but undeniably there. I tried to steady my breath. "Caleb, I don't think we should." A sound cut me off. A low, wet slurping noise like something licking its lips. I froze. It was coming from the corner of the room, the one cloaked in darkness, just beyond the reach of the candlelight. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Caleb inhaled sharply. "We have to end this, now." He moved the planchette to goodbye. But before we could lift our hands, it yanked itself away. No. The candles flickered violently. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with something oppressive and suffocating. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then slowly, agonizingly, the planchette began moving again. N. O. T. F. I. N. I. S. H. E. D. My breath hitched. Caleb's face was pale. "Too bad," he muttered. "We're finishing this." He shoved the planchette back to goodbye with such force that I expected it to splinter. The moment it touched the word, the wind outside slammed against the house with a deafening roar. The front door burst open. Every candle blew out at once, and the house was swallowed in darkness. For a moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was our breathing, ragged and shallow. Then a soft noise broke the silence. A drip, drip, drip. It was coming from the kitchen. Caleb grabbed my arm. "Come on." I didn't want to move. Every instinct told me to stay right where I was. But Caleb was already standing, dragging me with him. The house was pitch black. The only light came from the moon filtering weakly through the windows. It cast everything in cold, silvery shadows, making the furniture look twisted and unfamiliar. We stepped into the kitchen and stopped. The sink was running. Not full blast, just a thin stream of water trickling down the drain. But that wasn't the part that made my stomach drop. The counter was covered in raw meat. Packages of ground beef, steak, chicken all torn open. The contents spilled across the surface like something had been searching for the perfect cut. Some pieces were missing chunks, ragged bites taken out of them. And in the center of the mess was the penny. The same one we had used for the penny game. It was standing on its edge, perfectly balanced. Caleb exhaled shakily. "I didn't do this." "I know." We stared at the scene for another moment before Caleb finally reached out and turned off the faucet. The sound of the water stopped, leaving only the deafening silence of the house. I swallowed hard. What do we do now? Caleb licked his lips. "We follow the rules, we destroy the board." He grabbed it from the table and stormed toward the back door. I followed, heart pounding. The wind outside howled, bending the trees, shaking the house like it was trying to get in. Caleb grabbed the lighter from the shelf near the door and stepped onto the porch. I hesitated before joining him. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. Caleb set the board on the ground, flicked the lighter, and held the flame to the wood. Nothing happened. The flame flickered uselessly, licking at the surface but refusing to catch. Caleb frowned and tried again. The same result. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. Then the back door slammed shut behind us. We both spun around. Through the glass, I saw something inside the house. A shadow, tall, watching, grinning. Then a deep, rasping voice whispered from behind us. More. Caleb grabbed my arm. Run. We didn't stop running until we reached the end of the street. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. We only stopped when we reached the old community church, its heavy wooden doors looming in front of us. Caleb doubled over, catching his breath. What the hell was that? I shook my head, still trying to process what I had seen, what I had felt. We need to go back, I said finally. Caleb shot me a look. Are you insane? We have to finish this. Caleb hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he nodded. We walked back. The house was silent when we returned. The back door was wide open. The Ouija board was gone. And something had scrawled words across the kitchen wall in what looked like raw meat. You didn't feed me. My stomach turned. Caleb grabbed my wrist. His fingers dug into my skin. We are not staying here. For the first time, I agreed with him. We ran upstairs, waking Emily, grabbing our things, and getting the hell out. We never slept in that house again. But whatever we had let in, it wasn't done with us. We didn't sleep that night. Caleb, Emily, and I huddled in a cheap motel room across town, our belongings shoved hastily into backpacks. Our parents were still at their dinner, completely unaware that we had fled. Neither of us spoke about what had happened at the house. We just sat there, wide-eyed and silent, as if putting it into words would make it worse. But I already knew it was worse. I kept expecting something to follow us, something lurking in the corners of the room, something watching through the thin motel curtains. The presence I had felt in the house hadn't left my bones. It was still there, gnawing at my nerves, whispering in the back of my mind. More. 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 Caleb sat stiffly on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands. His fingers trembled slightly, barely noticeable, but I saw it. We have to end this, I said finally. Caleb exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. And how do you suggest we do that, Owen? We tried to burn it, and it wouldn't even catch fire. We didn't close the game, I said. We didn't follow the rules. Caleb glanced up at me. He knew I was right. Emily shifted uncomfortably. I don't want to go back there. Neither did I. But I knew we didn't have a choice. We waited until sunrise. Our parents still weren't home when we returned, but I wasn't surprised. They were probably still at the dinner party, drinking and laughing, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in their own home. The house was silent when we stepped inside, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making everything feel unreal. The air smelled stale, metallic, like raw meat left in the heat for too long. The words were still there, smeared across the kitchen wall. You didn't feed me. My stomach churned. Caleb clenched his jaw. Let's find the board and finish this. We searched the entire house. The dining table was empty. The living room was untouched. The back porch was barren. Nothing left but the scorch marks from where we had tried to burn it. It was gone. Caleb swore under his breath, "Where the hell is it?" I turned slowly, my skin prickling. The basement. I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to be right. But when I looked at Caleb, he already knew. Neither of us had ever liked the basement. It was unfinished, cluttered with old furniture and forgotten junk. The light bulb on the ceiling flickered when you pulled the chain, and the air always smelled damp like mildew and earth. We stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness. Emily shivered. "I'm not going down there." Caleb sighed. "Fine. Stay up here." I followed him down. The wooden steps groaned beneath our feet, the dust in the air thick and heavy. The basement wasn't big, just a narrow space with concrete walls, shelves lined with rusted tools, and piles of old furniture covered in moth-eaten sheets. And there, in the center of the floor, was the Ouija board. It sat perfectly still, untouched, as if it had been waiting for us. Caleb swallowed. "Let's get this over with." We knelt down, placing our fingers lightly on the planchette. For a second, nothing happened. Then the board shuddered beneath our hands. The planchette shot across the surface, moving so violently that I nearly pulled away. Huh. U-N-G-R. Yeah. I gritted my teeth. "We know." Caleb's voice was steady. "What do you want?" The planchette jerked. M-O-R-E. I felt a cold, sharp presence behind me. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Caleb didn't flinch. "We're ending this." The planchette slammed back to number. The air shifted. The entire basement grew impossibly cold, a dense pressure pushing against my chest like I had been submerged in deep water. Then, from the darkness, something moved. Not a shadow. Not a trick of the light. Something huge. It unfolded itself from the corner, towering over us, watching. Its limbs were long, wrong, shifting unnaturally as it crawled forward, its face shrouded in blackness. The only thing I could see was its mouth wide, grinning, teeth too sharp. Caleb and I both scrambled backward, but it was already there. The planchette moved. F. L. E. S. Huh. The thing laughed. A deep, gurgling sound that rattled in its throat, like something wet and decayed. Caleb grabbed my wrist. "Say goodbye." My voice barely worked. "Goodbye." The planchette didn't move. The air grew tighter, pressing against my lungs. The creature crawled closer, dragging itself forward in jerking motions, its fingers curling like talons. I choked. "Please, goodbye." It screeched. A sound so inhuman, so soul-wrenching that every nerve in my body seized. Caleb ripped the board off the floor, snapping it in half over his knee. Everything stopped. The air cracked like glass fracturing under pressure. The creature reeled back, its form distorting, unraveling, breaking apart in pieces. It shrieked as it collapsed in on itself, folding into the dark like something being pulled away by an unseen force. Then, silence. The air in the basement lifted. The pressure was gone. Caleb was shaking. His breathing was ragged, his hands clenched into fists. I stared at the broken board on the ground, my pulse still hammering. We stumbled back upstairs, locking the basement door behind us. Emily stared at us wide-eyed. "Is it over?" I swallowed hard. "I don't know." We never saw the board again. The house felt different afterward, lighter almost. The shadows weren't as deep, the silence not as suffocating. Our parents never questioned why we suddenly refused to sleep in the house. We moved out within the month, relocating to another town. But Caleb changed after that night. He never talked about what happened. He stopped playing video games, stopped laughing the way he used to. Some nights, I'd hear him awake in his room, staring at the ceiling. The nightmares never left him. And sometimes, even now, I see him flinch at the sound of something unseen. Like it's still there. Like it's still waiting. We never talked about that night. Not then, not years later, not even now. There were no explanations that could undo what we saw, no words that could make sense of something beyond the limits of reality. So, we did what we had to, pretended it never happened. We buried it. We moved on. Or at least we tried to. For months after we left that house, things were different. The three of us carried the weight of something unspoken, something lingering just outside the edges of our lives. Emily recovered the quickest. She was young enough to forget, or at least convince herself that it had been nothing but a bad dream. She went back to being her usual self, laughing, playing, slipping into the comfort of childhood, as if the horrors of that house had never touched her. I envied her for that, because for Caleb and me, forgetting wasn't an option. The thing in the basement had left its mark on us. Even after we moved into our new house, I would wake up in the middle of the night with the suffocating feeling that something was watching me. My room would feel too quiet, too still, as if I had been pulled into a space where the world no longer existed. And then there were the dreams. In them, I was always back in that basement. The air heavy, the darkness stretching endlessly. And in the farthest corner, something waiting. It never moved, never spoke, just watched. And though it never reached for me, I always woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering as if I had just barely escaped something I couldn't comprehend. But I got better. Slowly, the fear dulled, the memories faded, the dreams came less often. By the time I left for college, the past was just that, the past. Caleb, though, Caleb never got better. It wasn't just the nightmares with him. It was the way he changed. He used to be the fearless one, the loud one, the brother who was always daring me to push boundaries, to do something crazy, to take risks. But after that night, something in him shut down. He barely spoke, he barely slept, and he never let his room go completely dark. At first, I thought it was just the trauma catching up to him. But then, I started noticing other things. Strange, small things. Meat would go missing from the fridge, not full packages, but little pieces, just enough for someone to take without being noticed. I only realized it was happening when I caught Caleb sneaking raw steak into his room late one night. At first I thought he was just being weird, but then I remembered the words. "You didn't feed me." I wanted to believe it was just paranoia, that maybe he was just acting out, struggling to deal with whatever happened that night. But then I heard the whispers, late at night, coming from his room. They weren't loud, they weren't clear, but they were there. And sometimes, when I walked past his door, I swore I heard something breathing on the other side. When I finally confronted him, he just stared at me. "It's hungry," he said simply. His voice was empty, hollow. That was when I realized I had lost him. Not all at once. Not in a way that anyone else would notice. But piece by piece. And I didn't know how to get him back. The years passed. We grew up, went to college, moved to different cities, built our own lives. I went into architecture. Caleb bounced between jobs, never really settling anywhere. We didn't see each other often. Not because we didn't care, because it was easier not to. Because every time I saw him, I saw that night in his eyes. And every time I saw him, he looked worse. Paler, thinner, as if something was eating him from the inside out. It wasn't until last year that I finally realized the truth. Caleb disappeared 6 months ago. No calls, no messages. No sign of him at his last apartment. Nothing. At first I thought he had just gone off the grid. He had done it before, slipping away for weeks at a time, avoiding people, avoiding life. But this time was different. This time, there was no trace of him at all. And then, last week, a package arrived at my doorstep. No return address, no note. Just a single item inside. A Ouija board. It was old, warped, stained with something dark along the edges. I knew it wasn't the one we had used all those years ago. But the message scrawled across the back in faded, dried ink was enough to make my stomach drop. "Feed me." I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. And for the first time in years, I heard it whisper again. More. That night, I didn't sleep. And for the first time in decades, I knew it was never about the game. It was about Caleb. It had chosen him. And now that he was gone, it was coming for me. I sit at my dining room table now, staring at the board. I know I shouldn't. I should burn it, bury it, run. But I can't. Because I know, deep down, this isn't over. I can feel it, watching, waiting. And if I don't finish what we started, if I don't end it this time, it won't stop. It will never stop. So, I reach for the planchette. I place my fingers on the board. And I whisper the words I swore I'd never say again. "Kokuri-san, Kokuri-san, are you there?" The candle flickers. The air grows cold. And the planchette moves. Slowly. Deliberately. Yai. E. S. The day the substitute teacher arrived, it rained so hard the windows rattled. 4th grade was restless from the moment the bell rang, whispers bouncing off the walls, feet swinging beneath desks, pencils tapping. Rain always did that to kids. It made the air feel thick, the room too small, like energy had nowhere to go but out. When the classroom door finally opened, everyone went quiet. The woman who stepped inside was thin, too thin. Her black skirt clung to sharp angles, and her blouse was pressed so stiffly it barely moved when she did. Her hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful. She didn't smile, didn't clear her throat, didn't introduce herself. just walked to the front of the room and started writing on the board. Her handwriting was too perfect. No hesitation, no uneven strokes, just smooth, mechanical letters forming two words. Miss Lyle. No good morning, class. No explanation of where Mrs. Collins had gone. Nothing. The silence stretched. A few students glanced at each other, uncertain. Kids could always sense when something wasn't right, even if they couldn't put it into words. I sat at the second to last desk in the row by the window, my backpack still hanging open, forgotten. I didn't know what I had expected, but it wasn't her. I had been in this school since kindergarten, and in all those years, substitute teachers had fit into two categories. Overly enthusiastic, trying too hard to win us over. Checked out, barely doing the job. Miss Lyle was neither. She was empty. I had been staring, and when she turned around, my breath hitched, because she was staring directly at me. Her eyes were the wrong color. Not brown, not blue, not green, just gray flat and dull, like old film. The kind of gray that made you think of broken things. I swallowed and looked down at my desk. When I glanced back up, she had already turned away, moving with precise, measured steps toward the teacher's desk. Her shoes didn't make a sound. She picked up the attendance sheet but didn't call names. She just stood there looking at it, her lips slightly parted like she was reading silently to herself. The whole class sat stiffly in their seats, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. The rain hammered harder against the glass. Then, finally, she spoke. Her voice was wrong. It wasn't raspy or too deep or high-pitched. It was just off, flat, hollow, like the words weren't coming from her but from somewhere behind her. Take out your math books. No, please. No, let's begin. Just a command. Chairs scraped against the floor as we obeyed. I turned to the right page, but my hands felt cold, my stomach twisted in knots. She walked between the desks as we worked, passing so quietly I wouldn't have noticed her if I hadn't been watching. She didn't speak, didn't glance at the clock. Just moved. Up and down the aisles. And then I saw it. She never blinked. Not once. Not as she hovered over students, watching them write. Not as she circled the room, pausing behind chairs for a few long silent moments before moving on. The more I noticed, the harder it was to focus. I kept sneaking glances at her out of the corner of my eye. The way her movements were too precise. The way her hands never seemed to fully unclench. And the way she never touched anything. Not the desk, not the board, not the papers. Her hands hovered just above them, like she wasn't quite there. At lunch, the tension in the classroom finally broke. The moment the bell rang, kids bolted from their seats, a few whispering to each other as they disappeared into the hall. I stayed back. She didn't leave with the rest of us. Didn't say we were dismissed. She just stood at the teacher's desk, facing forward, staring. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I was the last one out. And just before I stepped into the hallway, I made the mistake of looking back. She was still watching me. Her gray eyes locked onto mine, unmoving. I turned and ran. At lunch, the cafeteria buzzed with low chatter, but something was off. Other kids had noticed. She's weird, Mia whispered, glancing around as if Miss Lyle might be lurking nearby. Did she even eat anything? I frowned. What do you mean? I stayed behind to grab my raincoat, she said. She just sat there, no food, no drink, just sitting. Lucas leaned forward. She didn't even use a computer. When Mrs. Collins is out, the subs always use the login on the teacher's desktop. But I walked past the room and nothing. The screen was black. We fell silent. She doesn't blink, I muttered. Mia shuddered. I thought it was just me. Lucas hesitated, then quietly, I don't think she has a shadow. My skin went cold. I stared at him, waiting for him to say, just kidding, to smirk, to turn it into some weird joke. He didn't. I felt suddenly lightheaded, like my stomach had dropped without warning. Because he wasn't lying. I had noticed it too, only I hadn't let myself believe it. The way she moved through the classroom, past the windows, past the light, past the places where shadows should have stretched. And yet, nothing followed her. I swallowed hard. We should tell someone. Lucas shook his head. Who? The principal? What are we supposed to say? Hey, we think the sub isn't human. Mia stabbed her fork into her food. Maybe she's just sick, she said, but she didn't sound convinced. I glanced across the cafeteria. At the far end, near the staff tables, a few teachers were talking and laughing over their lunches. They looked normal, real. I couldn't explain it, but I knew whatever Miss Lyle was, she wasn't one of them. A quiet, horrible thought crept into my mind, one that made my skin feel too tight, my throat dry. If she wasn't real, if she wasn't supposed to be here, then where was Mrs. Collins? The bell rang before anyone could say anything else. We stood, gathering our trays, and I hesitated. Something told me I shouldn't go back to class. That I should pretend to be sick, go to the nurse's office, anything but walk back into that room. But I didn't. Because deep down I already knew. I already knew that something was waiting for us. And we were about to find out what. The air in the classroom felt wrong when we walked back in. Not cold, not hot, just off, like the kind of stillness that came before a thunderstorm. The fluorescent lights hummed too loudly, flickering just slightly, but maybe that was my imagination. Or maybe it wasn't. Miss Lyle stood at the front of the room, facing the chalkboard, not writing, not adjusting papers, just standing there. Like she had been there the entire time, waiting. I hesitated by the door, gripping the strap of my backpack. The rest of the class shuffled past me, their voices lower than usual, their movements careful. I glanced at Mia. She avoided my gaze. Lucas did too. Because we all felt it. We knew something wasn't right. And yet we sat down anyway. Miss Lyle finally moved. Slow, deliberate, she turned toward us, her hands still pressed close to her sides. Those gray eyes, flat, emotionless, swept across the room, taking us in one by one. She didn't smile, didn't speak. And then she did something I still can't explain. She tilted her head. Not a normal tilt, not the kind people do when they're curious or confused. It was too slow, too exact, like a machine calculating something. Her neck shouldn't have bent that way. The room felt impossibly quiet. Then, finally, she spoke. Her voice was just as empty as before. Continue working from page 73. Chairs creaked as kids pulled out their books. Pages turned, pencils scratched. Everyone was too afraid to do anything but obey. I flipped open my own textbook, but I wasn't reading. I was watching. She didn't sit at the teacher's desk. She just stood there, watching us, watching me. I kept my eyes on my book, but I could feel it, that unblinking stare drilling into the side of my face. I tried to ignore it. I tried not to look. But I did. And the moment I glanced up, she moved. Not a normal movement. She didn't step, didn't shift. 1 second, she was at the front of the room. The next, she was behind me. I didn't hear her move. I didn't see it. But she was there, standing inches from my chair. My breath locked in my throat. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't. I stared straight ahead, fingers digging into the edge of my desk. Then, she leaned down, close enough that I felt the air change, the unnatural stillness around her. And in the smallest, quietest voice, she whispered my name. Not out loud. Inside my head, I shot up from my chair so fast it scraped against the floor. The noise shattered the silence, and all eyes snapped toward me. Miss Lyle remained where she was, staring at me with that blank, unreadable face. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. Her gaze stayed locked onto mine, and for the first time I saw it. A flicker of something beneath her skin. A ripple, like static on an old television screen, distorting her features for the briefest second before smoothing out again. I backed away, my breath uneven. Two need to go to the nurse. Miss Lyle didn't react. She didn't nod, didn't ask if I was okay. She just stared. And then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. She said, "Hurry back." Not a command. A warning. I grabbed my things and ran. I didn't go to the nurse. I went straight to the office. The hallway felt impossibly long as I walked, my mind racing. My legs still felt shaky from whatever had happened back there, my stomach twisting itself into knots. The receptionist barely glanced up when I entered. "Something wrong?" I nodded, my throat dry. "Two need to talk to the principal." Her fingers hovered over her keyboard. "About what?" "The substitute, Miss Lyle." She frowned slightly, tilting her head. "Who?" I swallowed. "The sub, the one covering for Mrs. Collins." A longer pause. Then she glanced at her computer screen, scrolled, checked something. A slow, uneasy expression crossed her face. "We don't have a Miss Lyle on record," she said. My heart stopped. I gripped the counter. "That's not possible. She's in my classroom right now." The receptionist's face paled. Mrs. Collins never called out today. The words didn't make sense at first. I stood there, frozen, trying to make it make sense. I turned back toward the hallway. The door to my classroom was barely visible at the end of it. Everything inside me screamed to run. Instead, I whispered, "Then who is in my classroom?" The principal called security. I sat in the front office, hands gripping the chair beneath me, my mind spiraling. The hallways were too quiet. The rain outside had stopped. Everything felt suspended, like time was waiting to see what would happen next. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Finally, the principal returned. Her face was blank, unreadable. There was no one in the classroom. I blinked. "What?" She sat down across from me, folding her hands neatly. The students were sitting quietly at their desks. No teacher present, no sign that one had ever been there. My pulse thundered. "That's not." I shook my head. "That's not possible. She was there. She was just there." A pause. Then, "Are you feeling all right?" I stared at her. Something wasn't right. The way she was looking at me, the way her fingers tapped against the desk too rhythmically. A horrible thought slithered into my mind. I turned toward the receptionist. She was watching me now. So was the janitor by the supply closet, the office aide by the window. Their eyes too still, too expectant. The air in the room shifted, and suddenly I knew. I wasn't supposed to ask questions. I wasn't supposed to notice. I wasn't supposed to see. Miss Lyle was gone, but something else was still here, watching, waiting. And now they knew that I knew. The office was too quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty but watching. The principal sat across from me, her hands folded neatly on the desk. The receptionist had stopped typing, her fingers hovering just above the keyboard. Even the janitor, who had been mopping the same tile for the past 5 minutes, stood still. His eyes settled on me. Something was wrong, and I had made a mistake. I had noticed. The realization hit me so hard I nearly choked on it. My stomach clenched, my hands gripping the chair beneath me so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wasn't supposed to notice that Miss Lyle had never blinked. I wasn't supposed to ask where Mrs. Collins was. I wasn't supposed to tell them, but I had. And now they were all staring. The principal smiled, but it was too polite, too controlled. "You seem a little disoriented," she said gently. "Maybe you should go lie down in the nurse's office for a while." Number. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but I didn't, not yet. Because if I ran now, I wouldn't make it. I had to be careful. I forced myself to swallow the panic rising in my throat, forced myself to nod. Yeah, maybe I just need some air. Her smile didn't waver. She stood slowly, like she had all the time in the world. "I'll walk you there," she said. The janitor had stopped mopping completely. He was just standing there, staring at the floor like he was listening. I couldn't stay here. I had to get back to my classroom. The second the principal stepped toward me, I moved. Fast. I pushed back from the chair and bolted into the hallway before she could grab my arm. I heard her voice sharp, calling after me, but I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. The hallway stretched too long in front of me. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing softly. I felt like I was running in slow motion, like the air had thickened around me, trying to hold me in place. I turned the corner, my shoes skidding against the linoleum. My classroom door was open. I burst inside, breathless, expecting chaos, expecting the students to be gone, to see nothing but empty desks and silence. But no. They were still there, sitting at their desks just as I had left them. Except now, they weren't moving. Every single one of them sat perfectly still, not writing, not whispering, just waiting. My breath hitched. Then Mia turned her head toward me. Slow, too slow, like a puppet on invisible strings. My stomach dropped. Her lips parted, but her voice was flat, wrong. "The principal is looking for you." I took a step back. Lucas turned his head next, the exact same way. "You should go to the nurse's office," he said. My heartbeat hammered against my ribs. This wasn't real. This wasn't real. I scanned the room, chest tightening. They weren't blinking. Not a single one of them. Then I saw the desk. Mrs. Collins' desk. For the first time, I noticed something was different. Her chair was pushed back, like someone had been there. But no one was. Or had been. A sickening realization churned in my stomach. Mrs. Collins hadn't called out. She had never left. And now I had no idea where she was. A sound echoed behind me, a soft click. The classroom door had shut. I spun around, and my chest nearly caved in on itself. Miss Lyle stood in front of it, blocking the exit. She hadn't been there a second ago, but now she was. Standing perfectly still, her arms at her sides, those lifeless gray eyes boring into me. The air in the room changed. Not colder, not warmer. Just different. Like the space itself had warped, like it was no longer part of the school, no longer part of anything. My skin crawled. I took a slow step backward. "Where is Mrs. Collins?" Miss Lyle tilted her head. That same unnatural tilt. The classroom groaned, not loudly, not like the building was shifting, but like the very air inside it had stretched. She took a step toward me. Not walking. Gliding. Like her feet weren't touching the floor at all. I felt something in me snap. I ran. I dove past the desks, knocking over chairs, my pulse a roaring sound in my ears. I reached for the window, slammed it open. The world outside wasn't there. Just blackness. No playground, no parking lot, no sky. Nothing. I stumbled back, my breath ragged. The classroom wasn't real anymore. A whisper curled around my mind, soft as silk. "You were never supposed to notice." I turned toward her, toward it. Miss Lyle's face rippled. For a brief moment, I saw something else beneath it. Something empty. Something that shouldn't exist. A shape without a shape. a presence that had been here long before me and would be here long after. And then, the door burst open. The spell shattered. Reality slammed back into place so fast it hurt. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The classroom window showed the real world outside the playground, the sky, the teachers walking by. I gasped, my knees weak, collapsing to the floor. Mrs. Collins stood in the doorway. Real, tangible, alive. She frowned, stepping inside. What on earth? I turned back to the classroom, my head still spinning. The desks, the kids, all of them were normal. Lucas blinked at me, confused. Mia whispered something to the girl beside her. The chairs I had knocked over were upright again, like nothing had happened. Miss Lyle was gone, vanished, like she had never been there. Mrs. Collins knelt beside me, concern in her eyes. Are you all right? I couldn't speak, couldn't move, because I knew they wouldn't remember. Not the students, not the teachers. No one. It had erased itself. I sat there, gasping, my whole body trembling. Mrs. Collins helped me up, but I barely felt it. I turned toward the chalkboard. It was clean. No sign of anything, except at the very bottom, written in the faintest chalk. A message. Just for me. I will return when you forget. I never spoke about it. Not to my parents, not to my friends, not even to Lucas or Mia, because I knew the truth. It was still there, waiting, for another student, for another day, for when someone else noticed, because that's how it works. It waits, until someone sees what they shouldn't, and then it plays the game all over again.